Once again, good afternoon, colleagues. As mentioned in my earlier talk, we have highlighted the value of free trade agreements. And we recall that there is a direct correlation between opening the economy vis-a-vis economic growth and development. So in other words, as you open your market for trade and investment, you would expect also improvement in the lives and also the welfare of your people, as well as, of course, industries for that matter. And we noted also that in establishing your comparative advantage in a bigger market, it is important that you make use of the various free trade agreements available to you or to your country in particular. And we have noted also that these FTAs are basically tools for competitiveness. For purposes of highlighting the advantages of an FTA, I would just zero in on number one, the importance of expanding your retail market. And number two is, of course, expanding also in the process your production capacity. In the process, as you expand your market, it is important that you will avail of this preferential arrangement set forth in the FTAs because basically this confers competitiveness to your products. Because the end result is that as you export your market to your product to foreign market, you can export the same at a lower price. And in that sense, by arriving or by touching base in that market, then basically you can price your product in a competitive manner vis-a-vis other similar products in that foreign market. But just the same, the conclusion and also implementation of FTA in the process is not something that is automatic. So our traders, our exporters must be well mindful how to avail and or utilize the same. And for purposes of talking about market access, one fundamental rule for you to avail of this preferential arrangement is to comply with what you call the rules of origin. So for those of you who have attended already previous sessions, you are already familiar with this. But just to highlight, when we talk about rules of origin, basically we are referring to the criteria needed to determine the country of origin of a product. And once you establish the same, then you can avail of the preferential tariff treatment under an existing free trade agreement. So in effect, this is some sort of the nationality of your product. Because once that nationality is conferred to your product, then you have the right to avail of the preferential arrangement extended to you or to your product in particular. Now, how do you determine or how do you comply with the rules of origin? In terms of rules, there are basically three sets of rules that we have to keep in mind when we are discussing rules of origin under ASEAN FTAs and ASEAN +1 FTAs. Number one is the wholly obtained or produced in a party. Second rule is produced entirely in one or more of the parties in an FTA. And the third set of rule is what you call substantial transformation. Now, when you talk about substantial transformation, you can further divide the same into three sets of rules. First is the compliance on the certain threshold on the value addition on the product. The second is change in tariff classification. And the third one is what you call the process rule. Now, when you talk about wholly obtained or produced product in a party, basically, these are products that are naturally occurring in that particular party or country, if you want to laymanize the same. And readily, since we're talking here of wholly obtained or wholly produced, immediately what comes to mind would be agricultural products. So basically, in the case of the Philippines, since we are very strong in bananas, coconut, corn, and cacao and fish also, then immediately we have to think that ASEAN plus the ASEAN plus one partners are possible markets where we can, of course, expand our retail market. So this is for agricultural products. But again, for our farmers, our producer, as I mentioned, not because we have an FTA, automatically you will enjoy these preferences. Because as I mentioned, you have to also comply and prove your compliance on these rules. So I think on wholly obtained, there will be no issue on that. The second rule is what you call the produce entirely in a party or one or more of the parties in the free trade agreement. So here you can avail of what you call cumulation. So for example, in the slide given, if you want to export, let's say, processed or preserved pineapples or canned pineapple, it could be that you will source the fruits from the Philippines and maybe sugar from Thailand, and then process the same into canned pineapple or maybe pineapple concentrate, and you export the same in ASEAN for that matter, and still you can avail of the preferential arrangement because you can claim that your product is produced entirely in a party or one or more of the parties of the FTA. So this is the second rule. Now, the third rule is substantial transformation. And notably, this is quite complicated because here there are certain thresholds that you have to comply if you are talking about regional value content. And also, when you talk about change in tariff classification, offhand, there must be some certain degree of processes that a product will have to undergo for it to change tariff classification or tariff heading for that matter. And the third set of rule under this particular ROO rule is the process rule. Now, on regional value content, take note that your objective here is to meet the agreed threshold for your product to be conferred what you call originating status. And as a matter of course, in our ASEAN agreements and ASEAN plus one FTAs, mostly the threshold that we have to comply with is 40% value addition. So this means that the contribution of the region, so in other words, those parties in the FTA, must not be less than 40%. And that tells us that you can source the 60% of your raw materials from other countries. Now, on change of tariff classification, you can just refer to either change in chapter or change in tariff heading or change in tariff subheading. On this particular rule, it is very important that if you want to tap foreign markets, you must be very familiar with the specific tariff lines of your product. Take note that in the Philippines, we have around 11,000 plus tariff lines. If I'm not mistaken, around 10,813 tariff lines. So for each tariff lines, your product must be properly identified. So that is one important consideration if you want to be an exporter. On the third rule, under substantial transformation, this is what you call process rule. So in an FTA, parties will have to agree what specific process will have to be undertaken by the exporting country so that its product will be conferred an originating status. So mostly, this will apply to certain manufacturing processes such as chemical reaction rule or recording rule. In the case of recording rule, maybe a good example of this would be if you are trying to export, let's say, contents that are fixed or attached in a medium, like CDs, for example. So the product would be the contents and the CD is just a medium. So the medium could come from other countries as long as the contents are generated and or produced in the party, then that can qualify as an originating product under the process rule if a recording rule has been agreed upon in the FTA. So basically, if you are going to summarize, you have only three main set of rules for purposes of establishing your originating status. And on the third rule, the substantial transformation, you have also three set of rules: the regional value content, change in tariff classification, and the process rule. Now, not because that you have complied with this set of rules, it means that you can already enjoy preferential arrangement. Because under the agreement, it is important that you must establish the same. So in other words, ipuprove natin that indeed you are compliant. Now, for purposes of, let's say, complying, for example, if you are going to show to your buyer or to the importing country that you are compliant, for example, in an RBC 45% rule or RBC 40, you have, of course, to break down the sources of raw materials and the value addition of the countries that contributed to your final product. So in this particular slide, you will note that the value coming from China is 25%, and then you have Thailand 10%, and Philippines you have 10%. So in, of course, ASEAN, China, the FTA, if you have RBC 40, then you can show that you have 45% value addition. Now, to prove this, you have to resort to now to the what you call proof of origin. So what are the proof of origin that we are referring to? Proof of origin, basically, these are issued by issuing authority. Actually, this is the conventional mode of proving the originating status of the product. But in the course of time and in various FTAs, there are some modalities also wherein proof of origin can also be issued through an origin declaration. And in fact, in some FTAs, just like in the RCEP, later on, you will have the self-declaration of the exporter or the producer himself. But for ASEAN plus ASEAN FTAs and ASEAN plus one FTAs, okay. Now, to give you a summary of these rules of origin under ASEAN plus one FTAs, I am presenting to you this particular slide, wherein here you will note that, let's say, for origin criteria, wherein we're talking about wholly obtained or produced in a party, basically this applies to all goods. And in all our ASEAN FTAs and ASEAN plus one FTAs, you will see that this is applicable. Now, for the second set of rule, that is what you call the produced entirely from originating materials in a party, this also applies to all kinds of goods. And this would apply specifically under ANSPATA, ASEAN China, ASEAN Japan, and RCEP. Now, you will note in the slide that in ATIGA, AKFTA, and ASEAN India, we have placed here not applicable. Not applicable means that in the FTA, this was not specifically mentioned. But for purposes of compliance, still you can avail of the same because the product is produced entirely in the party or one or more of the parties of the FTA. Now, the third rule is with respect to the substantial transformation in a party. And with the three subset of rules under this particular rule, you will note that RBC is also common to all these ASEAN and ASEAN plus one FTAs. For purposes of change in tariff classification, you will note that this is also a uniform. And for process rule, we have ATIGA, ANSPATA, ASEAN China, and ASEAN Japan, and RCEP. Now, take note that for purposes of RBC, we have a legend here that the threshold that we have to meet or comply with for all the ASEAN and ASEAN plus one FTAs except India is RBC 40. In ASEAN India, we have RBC 35, but it's quite, I would say, restricted because it has to be complemented further by change in tariff subheading on the tariff classification. So this is the summary. So at least for those exporters who would like to consider the ASEAN market and ASEAN plus one market, this is, I would say, a quick reference for purposes of knowing the rules of origin. Now, for purposes of the proof of origin, take note that certificate of origin, which I mentioned is the conventional mode of proving the originating status of the product. This applies to all FTAs that we have in ASEAN. On electronic submission of the certificate of origin, we have that under ATIGA, meaning within ASEAN. But right now, the same is under consideration in ASEAN plus one FTAs. For proof of origin that is declared by approved exporter, so in other words, the exporter has to be accredited first by the, of course, concerned authority, we have that under ATIGA. So if you are an approved exporter, and I would encourage exporter who is, of course, expanding their market in the ASEAN region to avail of this accreditation process so that it will be convenient for you to export your product. So we have that in ATIGA. And of course, in RCEP as discussed last week. Now for ANSPATA, this is now under consideration under the ongoing upgrade negotiations. So we hope that in other ASEAN plus one FTAs, when we review and of course upgrade the negotiations, we can also incorporate the same because this is exporter friendly. Now, on the proof of origin, wherein without any accreditation or approval, the exporter or the producer himself can declare that his or her product is originating, we have only such kind of arrangement under RCEP. But again, this mechanism will take time because from the implementation of RCEP, we still have 10 years to, of course, make the necessary arrangement, pass the necessary regulations so that we can implement this origin declaration by the exporter or producer himself. Now, knowing these three set of rules of origin and three subset of rules under the substantial transformation, it's also important for exporter or trader to, in a way, consider other factors that might affect the originating status of his or her product. So for example, compliance with minimal operation is also important. In most FTAs, this will be agreed upon by the parties. So what are the operations that must be at least complied with or undertaken by the exporting party before it can claim preferential arrangement? On direct consignment, this is usually covered also in an FTA because the understanding is that as much as possible, the product must be shipped directly from the exporting country to the importing country. In the case of transshipment, because the same cannot be avoided, there are certain rules and regulations that must be observed. So in other words, the product that was transshipped in a particular country must not, of course, be further processed, or it must not go outside of the customs jurisdiction. In other words, that the product must remain intact so that it can enjoy preferential treatment. Because if it is shown or proven that the product was altered, then of course the preferential arrangement will be denied. Treatment of accessories, spare parts, and tools must also be considered because in the normal course of trade, the usual accessories that are found in a certain product must be duly considered. If you will go beyond the normal practices, then of course your product will be, I would say, suspected already, and it can be denied preferential arrangement. So for example, in the case of CBU car, and it is the normal, of course, practice that if you have a reserve tire, you will only have one tire. But if you have a reserve tire of more than one, then of course your product becomes a suspect, and it can, of course, be questioned for purposes of availing preferential arrangement. Treatment of packing and packaging materials can also affect. De minimis, we discussed this last week. So there are certain products also that are tolerated for purposes of trade, wherein if it is just a minimum in terms of value, like in the case of the Philippines, like below 50,000, for example, then you just ignore imposition of certain tariffs because it's the de minimis. Identical and interchangeable materials. So these are the usual products or components of a product being used in the manufacturing process that are being monitored also for purposes of compliance with the threshold of the product. Neutral elements, usually a good example of neutral elements will be the mold, no, and other equipment used in the manufacturing process. So usually these are not being factored in also. Materials used in production, of course, that can affect the rules of origin and the unit of qualification. So how do you measure the value or the percentage of your product component in a final product? So as pointers for our exporters and traders, it is therefore important that when you export a product, you have to identify your product code. Okay, you have to determine also the specific tariff lines that is applicable to your product, particularly in the importing country. So you check your product's tariff eligibility then, if it is covered by FTA, and then you determine the applicable origin criteria for your product. So let's say if it's a garments and you want to, let's say, access the Cambodian market, then you have to know the rules of origin for garments in Cambodia, or if it is in Laos, or if it is in China. So you have to know what are the rules of origin. Is it RDC 40 or CTC, among others? And then you have to, of course, secure your certificate of origin depending on what is required under the particular FTA you are using. So is it a certificate of origin or origin declaration? And then, of course, you have to send that to your buyer because the buyer will have to make use of the same for purposes of availing the preferential treatment or arrangement. Okay. So these are the pointers. Now, take note that even if you have this preferential arrangement under an existing FTAs, and that for purposes of accessing the market, let's say in ASEAN or ASEAN plus one partner, your thinking would just be limited to these countries who are parties to the FTA. We have to bear in mind that notwithstanding that there are countries who are not party of the FTA, they can still take advantage of the existing FTAs that we have concluded with our FTA partners. And in fact, in the case of the Philippines, that has been our trust. We always tell other trading partners that they can locate here in the Philippines, process their product, manufacture their product, and export the same to our FTA partners. Because we want to package the Philippines as the manufacturing hub in Southeast Asia, or at the very least, research and development hub. Now, why this is important? This is important because in the process, we are already talking here of possible investments. We are also talking here of possible linkage or network of your company with other companies. So for example, if you are, let's say, into leather product manufacturing or processing, then it is possible for you to touch base with one European company whose core competence is also into leather product manufacturing. And then maybe through partnership, you can set up a factory here in the Philippines, produce more leather products, and access the bigger market. Because take note, in Southeast Asia alone, we're just talking of 650 million market. And if you have to take into account one of the pillars of economic integration, take note that we want also Southeast Asia to be a single market and production base. Now, if you want to boost your capacity, then it would be appropriate or better for you to partner also with some foreign companies and, of course, access the bigger market here in ASEAN. Now, better yet, if you can also make use of other ASEAN plus one FTAs because you'll be expanding your market. For example, ASEAN China. With China as a market, for example, a European company engaged in leather product, you can collaborate with this European company and access the China market. Because if the European company will export its product directly from Europe to China, it will be imposed 10 to 20% tariff rate. So that's one of your convincing factor now to the EU company that you better locate here in the Philippines because in the long run, your product will be competitive. And same arrangement with other companies like maybe freezer, refrigerators in the United States, or maybe car parts from Taiwan, or even vaccines. no, or biologic from Germany and other European countries. So in other words, this is one advantage that you can think of. So if you are, let's say, making use or trying to optimize the benefits of the FTA, look at it not only from the perspective of having market access, but look at it from the perspective of investment also. And again, when you talk about investment, it is not confined to the parties in the FTA because you can even go outside of the FTA region. So I hope with my talk, I was able to, in a way, enlighten you with these rules of origin and also some strategies by which you can take advantage of our ASEAN FTAs and ASEAN Plus One FTAs. Maraming salamat.